All right. Let's get to another video. All right. So now we're looking at, we've talked about inflation, talked about GDP. The next big topic is employment, or as I like to call it, unemployment, because I'm a half empty glass kind of guy, right? So we have employment and unemployment. Let's look at how do we decide, or how does the Labor Bureau define unemployment? It's an individual who does not have a job, is actively looking for work in the last 4 weeks, was temporarily laid off waiting to be called back to that job. So let's look at some numbers. All right, so we have, this is January 2019. If we look at the population is 329.1, labor force is 162, people not looking for work is 165.9. Okay, of the 162, 6.3 of them are unemployed. They're looking for work in the last month. Okay, they do not have a job. That's 3.8% roughly. 156.9% are employed. All right, so we're looking here at the civilian labor force. So that begs the question, what is the labor force? Well, the labor force is defined as anyone or everyone not in the military and not in prison over the age of 16 who is either employed or unemployed. Okay, and if you see in the bottom here, it says two categories that comprise our labor force is the employed and the unemployed. So let's go back to the graph, and you see the civilian labor force, employed, unemployed. What we're not including in the labor force are the people who have no job and are no longer looking. We call them the discouraged worker. So what ends up happening is you take out the discouraged worker, these people want jobs, but they've just given up looking because it's just a waste of time. At least that's how they feel. So they're discouraged, so we take them out of the labor force. To give you a quick example, say there's 100 people. 10 of them are unemployed. So the labor force is 90 people employed, 10 people unemployed, right? So the labor force is 100. So we have an unemployment rate of 10%. Well, if 5 of those people get discouraged and leave the labor force is now 95, and 5 people are unemployed of the 95, which comes out to like a 5.3% unemployment rate. So you can lower the unemployment rate just by removing the discouraged workers out, right? Which is why we look at the thing called the labor force participation rate. Okay, that takes the employed and the unemployed, right, which is the labor force. So it's the labor force is the numerator. The denominator is a civilian non-institutionalized, that's the prison and military, population. Okay, so if I went back a second, it's this 95.6 million people. That now is going to be added to the 162, and that would be my denominator to get my labor force participation rate. Okay, so we take so these are numbers for November 2020, I believe these are the numbers. Okay, it's definitely 2020 after the pandemic. So we have 149.7 million people are employed, 10.7 million people are unemployed, 100.6 are not in the labor force. So how do we get the labor force participation rate? We take the 149, the 10.7, and we divide it by 149, 10.7, and the 100.6. Which is 160.4 divided by 261 times 100, which gives me 0.614 times 100, which gives you a participation rate of 61.4%. Okay, so 61.4% of adults who could work, 61.4% of them are working. All right, so let's just look at just crunch the numbers a little bit more. This was the November 2020 numbers that I just used. Now let's look at the 2019 numbers. Okay, and we had a labor force participation rate at 63.2%. All right, now you'll notice the difference in the numbers here. The labor force was 164 in 2019 before the pandemic. After the pandemic, it's 160. Not in the labor force was 95. Now there's 100. That's the difference right here. The 160 and the 100 and the 164 and the 95. The difference is these people who were working before are now discouraged and they're no longer looking for work. Okay, and we have the unemployment of 149. So the unemployed people, we have about 5 million more people unemployed now than we had a year ago. And again, that's all based on the pandemic. All right, now what I want to try, see if this works. I'm going to add a video to this, and it's about 3 minutes. So let's just take a quick, well, it's 1 minute actually.
Oh, well, toothpaste factories are taking a bit of time off.
Like summer vacation?
Sure. Something like that.
In fact, it wasn't like a vacation. The upswing on candy sales has led to Horizon cavities, which led to Horizon toothpaste sales. With the extra money, the factory had decided to modernize, eliminating Mr. Bucket's job.
Barely making ends meet if it was.
You'll find another job. Until then, I'll just think I'm superhuman. Don't worry, Mr. Bucket. I'm not quite sure.
Okay. So I show you that video because I'm going to show you types of unemployment. I want you to figure out where Mr. Bucket fills in. Mr. Buckets fills in on this list. Did I just add an S where it didn't belong? I'm not sure. Frictional unemployment, which is individuals searching for jobs or waiting to take jobs soon. Right. So those kind of people we're not that worried about because they're waiting. The job is there. They're just looking for the connection. Then we have structural unemployment, which occurs due to changes in the structure of demand for labor, right? Your skill set, or you've been replaced by technology. Then there is cyclical unemployment, which is bad unemployment. We can live with frictional and structural, right? Structural unemployment says that we're having progress. We're getting more technology, we're better off. Frictional, we're just waiting for the job, but cyclical is caused by a decrease in the demand for labor. Okay, so it's during the recession phase of the business cycle. And I will show you the business cycle in the next video. So let's look. There are 7 types of unemployment. Cyclical, structural, and frictional, right? Cyclical, the demand for the good has led to the unemployment. Structural is an advance in technology, job outsourcing, or your skill set doesn't match the job requirements. Then we have frictional unemployment, which are people who voluntarily aren't working, people who are relocating and waiting on that job, people who have graduated, newly entering into the workforce, and then people who are re-entering the workforce. So you see this picture of this young man stayed home to raise his family, and now the children are old enough, and he is now going to start to look for work. So he would be defined as frictional until he found the job. All right, so we want to look at something called full employment, or also known as the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, it's a full employment level unemployment. It's the amount of unemployment we have with just frictional and structural unemployment. Currently, we say that the full employment level is 96%. That's the number we will use in this class going forward. It can vary over time based on demographics, job search methods, policies by the government. All right? Actual unemployment can be above or fall below the natural rate. Okay, so there are times where it will be above and there'll be times it will be below. So let's just look at, since 1970, the blue line is the full employment number. Okay, and the red line is the actual unemployment rate. So the blue line is the rate of unemployment that we can have without seeing a spike in inflation. Okay, so the blue line, as you see, it's going down because we've had the ability to hire more workers without seeing spikes in inflation. And when that happens, the unemployment number goes down, the full employment number, okay? We also call it the natural rate. Now let's bring in the inflation rate. Okay, now again, the red line is the unemployment rate. So anytime we see the unemployment rate below the full employment, below this blue line here, we see the reds below it. Look what happens as the red goes under the full employment number, where it's lower, we start to see this spike, or this, it's a spike, it's an increase in inflation. Okay, here it's almost up to 5%. Then we see here again it falls, and then we get another spike in inflation. And during the 70s and 80s, the inflation rate was really high. Okay, 12.5. But every time we see these spikes, it's when there is a decrease in unemployment below the full employment rate. And that's when they say that means we can't maintain the current rate. This full employment rate is the rate we want to have. Okay, and as I've outlined all of these, you can see unemployment falls below full. There we see the spike in inflation. All that happens all up until this point. During the Trump presidency, we had unemployment below full employment. Full employment was like 4 to 5%. We had unemployment of 3.8%. Everybody was waiting for this spike. We never got it. We actually see falling inflation rates, and we're trying to figure out why that might be. Okay? So now we're going to pull up the graph one more time, and I just want you to look at this graph because it shows you the trade-offs in unemployment and inflation, right, that we've talked about in the past. Unemployment goes up, inflation goes down. And you can see that throughout the graph. The only time we may not be seeing it is here. And also, if we go to the 70s, both were going up at the same time, which is known as stagflation. All right, one more slide. Unemployment. Some of the criticism of unemployment is workers who want to work full-time are working part-time, and they're counted as if they were full-time. So we can say that the unemployment rate is 3.8%, but there are people in that employment who would prefer to have a full-time job. But we see them as having full-time jobs. Okay? And then there is the discouraged workers I spoke about earlier. Workers are not counted as unemployed. So they give up, they're fed up looking for a job, and now they're out of the labor force, which means they're no longer counted in the unemployment rate. All right, so we've gotten GDP done, we've gotten inflation, and now we've got unemployment. The next video we will do will be on the business cycle, and then we will move into analyzing the economy. All right, folks, have a good night.